Jim asked me to talk about presumed consent, and his initial title was, is it cracked up? What is it?
Is it all cracked up to be? I thought that somebody
all
told me that was your title. So.
I changed the title.
Okay.
I knew it was going to be filmed. It was appropriate. I just came back from a management team meeting for 2 days. We get together mid-year to review our data and our systems and operations. So our management team from Gift of Life, from the Institute, and from the Family House. And it's now 20-some people. It's grown quite a bit. The neat thing is the first 6 months of the year, you're going to see this in a minute, was the highest number of organ donors ever recorded by us or the United States. We had 226 organ donors. It translated into 622 organs transplanted. And then bone and tissue donation is the highest ever recorded anywhere in the U.S. We had about 680 tissue donors for the first 6 months. So our tissue team, which actually does the surgical recoveries, we're very, very busy. And it's not a huge group of people. But it has helped to have our operating rooms here because that way, when families agree, which is 98% of the time, not only do they agree to donation, but they allow us to transport their loved one here. And that makes it simpler for our staff because a team of 3 surgical techs can actually do the surgery. And instead of driving 2 hours one way, doing the surgery at Reading Hospital or in Lancaster or in Wilmington, they actually, we have a transport team that actually transports the body here. And that one team can actually perform 3 or 4 surgeries in a day without driving that 2 hours each way every time. So it's been really something and really efficient, which has helped increase the number of bone donors. So that the number of bone donors will translate into, there's probably 30 bone transplants like Pam had per donor. So that's like 18,000 potential transplants just in the first 6 months. So, and again, it's because of families saying yes to donation and a great team of people who work 24/7. So I'm just lucky to be here and to be able to talk about the good things that we're doing. So this is a talk that's interesting. Presumed consent comes up all the time in discussions in transplantation. It comes up in legislators' minds who think they're going to come in and save the world because they heard that presumed consent is the magic bullet that will cure the organ donor problem for those who are waiting. It's not quite that simple. And what I did was to get some experts' opinions actually from all over the world for this talk, Jim, just so you know the research that I did. You'll be surprised about what they say, particularly in those countries who have presumed consent. So let's get started. So this is all of you. This is the Hahnemann team from the DASH, our biggest DASH ever. So a little about Gift of Life. You see these slides often. I like to play them often. Obviously, we're a nonprofit. We're 37 years old. We cover 3 states and 138 donor hospitals, 15 hospitals that do transplants, 44 different organ programs, and there's probably well over 400 to 500 transplant professionals in our community. It's huge. From transplant surgeons to transplant physicians to the coordinators to the social workers, transplant administrators, dietitians, all the people that you guys meet. There's a lot of them here. We have a rich group of transplant experts. Our population is about 10.3 million. Our activity level, I combined 2 years here, so you have to divide by 2, is well over 400 donors a year. And in the last 2 years, over 2,200 transplants, which is the highest volume anywhere in the U.S., and the highest per capita rate, meaning donors per million, anywhere in the world. And I'll show you some of that data. Also, the bone recovery, so I'll show you some data on that, about over 1,000 bone recoveries a year, and about 4,700 eye recoveries a year. About 2,500 a year. Totally over 30,000 transplants and 375,000 tissue grafts. We're accredited by a number of organizations. AOPO, which is the OPO accreditation group. AATB, I just literally got the recertification today for our tissue recovery team. And these certifications are important to show both quality and qualifications of what we do. The Eye Bank Association of America, because we have an eye bank in central Pennsylvania, and of course UNOS, Medicare, and all the other governmental certifications. You know where you are, and this building, we've been here 6.5 years already. Can you believe that?
No.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. It's still, knock on wood, looks in pretty good shape. Our lab is very active downstairs, performing not only laboratory testing for gift of life, but they also do it for New Jersey, New York, and New England. About 25% of all the laboratory tests for donors in the country are done here. And they ship the samples in and wait for the results. You know about the recovery suites, the preservation lab that's there, our Research and Training Institute. We have people coming from China. We have a contingent of 6 people coming on Monday to visit us because deceased donation in China really doesn't exist from brain dead patients. They have in the past had a sketchy history of executing prisoners for organs, which is obviously not the way to do it. And we're also concerned that they might start a paid living donor program. So they're coming here to hopefully learn how to set up a deceased donor program. And the Red Cross of China has been the official appointee of the government to actually perform those duties. So this is who does what, and listening to Ed about his daughter. You went to a great place. There's a lot of other places to go, but as you heard, you don't have to be a blood relative to donate. So it doesn't have to be her mom. It could be a friend. It could be you. It could be your wife. It could be anybody. And even if you're not compatible, we have an exchange program where we actually match people up. Living donors who have incompatibilities between their loved one, we match them up with another person or another group of people. We just did publicity a couple weeks ago on a 5-way chain of living donor transplants, started by an anonymous donor, by a stranger who she didn't know who she was giving to, and the kidney went to a guy who was who happened to be high antibody titer. He had a prior transplant and he was incompatible every single time with the deceased donor kidney, and he was compatible with her and he got the kidney, and he had a friend who donated to somebody else, and etc. So there's other options than sitting and waiting and watching your daughter on dialysis. You have to pursue those, just a suggestion. So we have a lot of transplant expertise in the community, from small children's hospital centers like St. Christopher's to large centers like Penn, who does all the transplants in the community. And as I said, we coordinate about 1,200 local transplants a year for deceased donors, and there's about 250 living donors each year in our area. This is the waiting list nationally. Over 110,000 people waiting nationally, and proportionally it's the same locally. So, in the nation there's 85,000 people waiting for a kidney, or 87,000. And then locally we have 6,500 people waiting, 5,200 are waiting for kidney, almost 1,000 waiting for liver, 112 for heart, 70 for lung, 98 for pancreas kidney, and 60 for pancreas alone, and 2 for heart lung. So this is our battle. This is what my staff, every time we do meetings, we have staff meetings once a month. After all the celebrations that we do for the good work, we end with this slide, meaning our work's never done, and we can't sit on our laurels. We have to continue to push hard and make sure every family gets the opportunity to say yes to donation or get people to sign up in the registry. So here's our track record. I have a little prediction for 2011, over 450 organ donors, which would be our best year yet. Hopefully I'm not jinxing ourselves. This is what it looks like for the different types of donors. I won't get into this today, but donation after cardiac death gives families another option. These are patients who are not survivable, but they're not officially declared brain dead, and the families decide independently to withdraw the ventilator, and now we have a way to allow kidneys, liver, and sometimes lungs to be procured and transplanted. We've done now over 750 of these cases, and over 1,300 transplants have been transplanted with the same success rate, if not better success rate, particularly with kidneys, as a brain dead donor. And that's the largest experience anywhere in the world in terms of the numbers. So those organs, 1,300 people, those organs would have been buried if we didn't have this technique. And we were one of the first to do this in the country. So here's the number of transplants. It's a little bit stagnant when you compare it, although you can see from 95 on, it's continued to grow. And we've been around 1,100 or so, 1,200 transplants each year. Even though donors have gone up, the number of organs per donor has actually gone down slightly because the donor pool has changed and shifted from younger donors to older donors, and older, I will use very delicately, people like me are considered older. Anybody over age 55 with any type of disease complications like hypertension or diabetes is considered an expanded donor by a criteria set up by UNOS. Anybody over age 60 is automatically considered an expanded donor. So, but we use a lot of organs from those patients. And one of the problems with the allocation is if we could find ways to change the allocation system like they do in Europe for older organs to go automatically to older people, we'd get a lot more used. Meaning that there would be an age adjusted allocation system so that younger organs would go to younger people. Right now what happens is an organ becomes available, the list prints out, and whoever, if it's a 16-year-old donor and a 70-year-old prints out, 70-year-old gets the kidney. The problem is the life years that we get out of that kidney probably went down by 20 or 30 years because, you know, if the guy's 70 years old, he gets the kidney. I hope he lives till 90, but if it went into an 18-year-old, could have lived 50, 60 years with their kidney. So these are some of the issues that we have in the allocation system that we're trying to get changed and get UNOS and the government in particular to allow it to change. And we'd get more organs actually used. We wouldn't waste time getting the older organs transplanted, which sometimes happens. That's our track record, over 30,000 transplants through Gift of Life over the last 37 years. Now this is bone donation. So this is kind of interesting. And remember, bone donation is someone, bone is typically the long bones of the leg, ligaments, skin, cornea, those kind of things. But we're focused here primarily on bone and ligament donation from the lower limbs. These are families who lose someone, and because there's so many potential cases, out of 40,000 calls we get a year, 45,000 from hospitals of people who die, about 4,000 to 5,000 people probably can donate bone. So it's an estimate, we really don't know. Because after someone passes away, with organs, if your heart stops, you can't typically be an organ donor. You know, people think that if you're in an accident, oh, you can be an organ donor. No, you can't be, because you have to be on a ventilator, your organs still have to be functioning, you have to be in a hospital, all these different things take place. Tissue, 24 hours after the heart stops, we can recover bone and other tissues. So we have a lot of opportunity to approach families. What's interesting about it is with most of the bone donor families, we don't talk to them face to face like we do with organ donor families. With patients in the hospital, we actually go to the hospital, talk to the family, work with the team at the hospital in the critical care unit, and we could be there for days sometime. With tissue donation, it's often sudden, and someone passes away, and then we have to literally cold call the family. And the first thing we do is check the driver's license registry, and if they're on the registry, then that conversation is a lot easier. They're a donor. And then we have to do the screening and so forth and see if they're suitable. So we've changed the way we've done this by virtue of, rather than sending families home, we actually keep the family at the hospital till we call back the unit. And that way they're still there to be supported by the hospital staff. We used to say, I'll send the family home, give them some time. We could never find people. They'd be at their church. They'd be at the funeral home. Their line would be busy for 7, 8, 12 hours at a time. We never got to them, and we'd run out of time to recover the tissues. And the families often say, once we got them, oh gosh, I wish I'd have known. We would have wanted to do that. So now we have a different system. We've trained the emergency rooms and the critical care units and nursing supervisors. Call us when the patient passes away, keep the family there until we call back, which is typically 5 minutes. And that's what the call center does downstairs. This is what's happened nationwide, and this is sort of getting into some of the issues. So you can see the yellow line represents deceased organ donation. And you can see that between 2003 or so and 2006, it went up about 25%, from about 6,000 to about 8,000 donors. So then you can see that nothing's changed nationally. 8,000 donors every year. And about 23,500 organs come from those deceased donors. Roughly about 2.9 or 3 organs per donor. And then the blue line is living donors. And look what happened there. So from 95 to 2000 or so, when they started this laparoscopic kidney nephrectomies, taking out kidneys with a laparoscope instead of making 8 to 10 inch incisions in somebody's side and take out a rib and remove a kidney, they developed this technique to take the kidney out. And so more people were willing to do it, because typically people are discharged from a kidney donor within no more than 3 days. A lot of people are actually only in the hospital that day, and they're back home. Now, they're not going back to work right away. But it's 3 little pencil holes and a little incision like that below their belly button instead of this huge gaping incision through their ribs and stuff. But what's happened is that, it went up to about 7,000 donors, and then it dropped back, and it's been around 6,200 or so. And we can't figure out why it hasn't continued to grow. So that's why we instituted this matching protocol for incompatible living donors, so we can get more people to understand it's not just living related donors. It's anybody who wants to donate can donate to somebody in this country. So we literally have 300 million potential organ donors as far as I'm concerned. But someone could donate a kidney. And so a lot of people these days donate to someone in their church or work. More than half of the kidneys now are non-related kidney transplants, non-blood related. So that's where I'm not a transplanter, I'm not a surgeon, I'm not a doctor, but I just gave you some medical advice. I shouldn't have done that. But it makes a lot of sense to pursue that. Okay, so that's what's going on in the country. We still have people dying on the waiting list, which is horrible, and that's what we're here to do, is to try to stop that. So let's talk about presumed consent. So the concept of what we do is called opting in, illicit consent. Anyone who is not given consent is not a donor. Family members may be required to give consent or may veto a potential recovery if the donor has consented. Well, that's not exactly true. This is from a talk that somebody gave. And I'll talk more about what the real truth is on that, but that's what people's perceptions are. Presumed consent is opt-out. Anyone who has not refused is a donor. So they have to say one way or the other whether they, if they don't want to be a donor, they have to say it. Otherwise, they're a donor. And then you'll see that some of the things, family members might veto a potential recovery. There's a lot to this. This is sort of the skimming the surface, and some of it is actually not totally accurate. So, presumed consent. The potential donor is presumed to have wished to donate if he or she has not expressed an objection during their individual's lifetime. One of the problems is, how do they do that? Not every country that has presumed consent actually has a system to opt out. They don't have a computer registry to necessarily opt out. So how are you supposed to tell people that? How are you supposed to officially, legally opt out? It's a problem. If the potential donor had not expressed a preference for organ donation, the objection of the next of kin is sufficient to preclude donation, even though the potential donor's consent is presumed. Well, that people say, well, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. It does not make any sense. But that is actually not written into the law. That's how it's practiced, and I'll show you that in a minute. The recorded preference of a potential donor for organ donation overrides the objection of that individual's next of kin. So that is true with presumed consent. In other words, they can opt out, and then the next of kin can't come in and say, yeah, but we want him to be a donor anyhow, even if he opted out. If they actually recorded it, they can't do that. All reasonable efforts are made to contact the potential donor. Next of kin. Okay, so here are the countries that have it. Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Czech, Estonia, Finland, France, Greece, Hungary, Israel, Italy, Latvia, Luxembourg, Norway, Panama, Paraguay, Poland, Portugal, Singapore, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Turkey. Everybody except Panama is in Europe or Eastern Europe. Interesting. Well, there's one South American country. Brazil had it, I'll show you in a minute, but they withdrew it. So what do we have? Organs may be removed from a deceased person if the person had expressed consent to such removal during his or her lifetime. And depending upon law, domestic law, such consent may be made orally or recorded on a donor card, driver's license, or identity card, or in a medical record of the donor registry. When the deceased has neither consented nor clearly expressed opposition to removal, permission should be obtained from a legally specified surrogate, usually a family member. So if somebody doesn't make a decision, families can do it. So this is, I'm not going to get into this specific law. So here are the laws with explicit consent. We call it first person consent, where it's a legal document that you've made the decision yourself. Australia, Canada, Chile, Cuba, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Guatemala, Ireland, Japan, Jordan, Lithuania, Malaysia, Mexico, Netherlands, New Zealand, South Africa, South Korea, Thailand, UK, us, Venezuela. So here's some of the data. Now it's a little hard to read. And what this measures is a crude way, very crude way, of success in donation. And what does it mean? Well, we don't have a good denominator for donor potential. We should, but it's not uniform across the world of how we determine how many people could have donated. We do what we call record reviews, in addition to, since we have routine referral, which I'll talk about, well then we can measure how many of those people could have been donors. But a lot of these countries don't have that type of sophistication or relationship with hospitals. So what's the crudest measure that's reported anywhere? How many people live there? But these are live people, right? We're measuring against the population, not necessarily dead people, it could be donors. So there is a lot of dilemma, but this is the way that performance has been measured since I've been a coordinator, over 30 years. And there's no better way that's been established anywhere in the world to make it uniform. Even in the US, we all measure ourselves differently in terms of donor potential and what the denominator should be. But you can't lie about the fact that there's 10.3 million people who live in our service area, or 7 million who live in North Jersey, or, you know. So the point is, these are well-established denominators that can do measurements. And so what happens is they take crudely, it's a crude measurement, the number of people who actually became organ donors that donated at least one organ, kidney, liver, heart, whatever, and you divide it by the population. So Spain, right now, has the highest per capita in the world, 34 donors per million population, donors per million, highest in the country. Doesn't talk about utilization of organs, it's just procurement of organs. Doesn't say they got them transplanted, it's just procurement. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And then look at, I used Puerto Rico, I shouldn't, but I was doing a talk to talk about Puerto Rico's success. So it's part of the U.S. and part of the U.S. data. But I pulled them out because at one time they had 3 organ donors in Puerto Rico about maybe 10 or 15 years ago before they set up a good system. It's 4 million people. And now, if you look at them as a quasi-country, they're 29 donors per million. Catholic, Hispanic country, interestingly, a lot of support for donation. And their systems there, health system, is not like here in Philadelphia. It's, if you walk into their hospitals down there, it's a little different in terms of the level of care. You can see Portugal is next at about 26, US at about 26, Belgium, Estonia, etc. And then you can see Austria is about 20. And Austria actually has the oldest history of presumed consent. Why? Well, there was a king who thought that in order to advance medicine in Austria, that every person should be subject to autopsy in the mid-1800s, when science was just advancing and medicine was advancing. So they basically had the rule of law that everybody could be autopsied without asking the family. So the history of that translates back 150 years. And then as time went on, when organ transplantation started, they were one of the first countries to pass presumed consent. Similar type of thing. The body, no choice, government can do it. Yet, the results are not terribly exciting, 20 donors per million. And then all these other countries you can see are measured of varying sizes, Ireland and Sweden and Finland, all in the 14s. Canada, 14, 12 to 14 donors per million. Not great turnouts. So there's Spain. They're considered the world's leader because of their country, which is about, 45 million people, something like that. About 4 times the size of our region. And so they have pretty good outcomes. And I'll tell you why they have that. And then here's us. I have to put this in, of course. So we're probably about 30% better than them, 30 to 35% better per capita. We're up around 43 donors per million. And this year it may be up around 45 donors per million. So we don't have presumed consent. We got a tough population. In Philadelphia County, probably over half the population is either African American, Hispanic, or Asian. And it often is lower support, particularly in the African American community, for consent to donation. We see it on the registry. In our counties for zip codes that we think are heavily populated by African Americans, the sign-up rate's probably around 20%. You go to Chester County or State College, it's up around 60 to 65%. So, and again, I hope I'm not making it a racist statement per se, but what it is that there's less support and less trust in the community for medicine in general, not just organ donation, and making decisions ahead of time for a long track of history related to minority population. And that's just a fact, and we have to do better. By the way, we hired a new person. Did you guys meet her yet? Finally. Yeah, we have another multicultural affairs coordinator, and I think she's going to stay. Okay. So here we are, and this is sort of pulling out some of the countries you can identify with. Spain, US, UK is at 15 donors per million. National health care system. Australia, 12. I was just there back in March trying to help rebuild their system and make it work. Israel, which has presumed consent, 10. Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, Japan. sort of gives you a smorgasbord around the world. Here's the donors per million in comparison to 4 years. You can see Spain at around 34, us at around 42, 43 in 2009. So here's a lot of these articles I pulled. And here's an article, an opinion piece. Presumed consent is unnecessary. The appeal of presumed consent is based on the belief that if consent is a problem, presuming it will solve the problem. Misconception, underlying belief is that presumed consent equates with organ donation. Death is not an isolated personal event, but a profound family matter. The primacy of families' wishes must be accepted as it is in Spain. Otherwise, trust in the donation process could be greatly undermined. In 1997, Brazil introduced a hard form of presumed consent, meaning they automatically would go to the operating room without talking to the family. Soft presumed consent is what the other countries have, which I'll talk about later, meaning that they still consult the family. That did not require consent of the family. In response to widespread public and media disquiet, the legislation was amended to make consultation with the family mandatory. But by then, the damage had been done, and the legislation was entirely revoked in October of 1998, in less than a year and a half. Advocates of presumed consent often cite the Spanish organ donor system as an example of success. In fact, what Spain has shown is the highest levels of donation can be obtained while respecting the autonomy of the individual and family, and actually without actually using presumed consent. I'll show you some more about it. So this is a note that I got yesterday when Rafael Montezan is the head of ONT, which is a Spanish organization for the whole country. They're an organ procurement organization, and they run the allocation system. So it's sort of like combining all the OPOs in the U.S., okay, and putting UNOS on top of that to do the allocation system. That's what ONT is. I can't pronounce it. Organizational Nacional de Transplant. So it says, hello Howard, nice to hear about you. Do not trust very much in presumed consent approaches to improve organ donation, because at the end, at least in Europe, most countries use soft presumed consent, which in practice is more or less the same than an opt-in approach. Furthermore, we had the same law 30 years ago when our donor rate was really low. So they had presumed consent. British had this discussion for years, and I published a paper with John Febra and Paul Murphy, which expresses what I think about it. Anyway, it is true that EU countries with presumed consent have now higher donor rates than those without. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Belgium, Austria, Croatia, versus UK, Ireland, Germany, Holland, Scandinavia. In general, Eastern countries are much lower because of a lack of adequate structure. There are, however, two main differences between the first and second group of countries. Those with higher donor rates have in-house medical coordinators. I'll tell you more about that. And not the other, although they are changing. Furthermore, those of the first group are mostly Catholic, less limitations of vital support therapies related to brain death, but there is no DCD. There's no donation after cardiac death, which we actually do in the U.S. While the other are mainly Protestant, more limitation of vital support therapies and less brain death pronouncement, and more DCD. The acceptance of presumed consent by the population seems to be easier in Catholic countries. Another point for me is U.S. data is very good for such a big country with extremely high rates in specific areas, like human life. Is a reason to support and presumed consent is not necessary to improve donation. And I really do think that a country that appreciates so much the value of freedom, like the States, would accept, I do not really think that, would accept presumed consent. I'll send you a table, which I'll show you later. So what he's saying is, if you look at that circle, where it includes Portugal on the left, Spain, Italy, France, and Belgium, you can see that those are the countries that have these people called in-house MD transplant coordinators. What does that mean? Well, all of our coordinators are outside the hospital, so we have to get called. We're like the Maytag repairmen. You know, we have to wait for the phone to ring downstairs before we hear about a potential donor situation. We're not in the hospital. We do education in the hospital, but on a case-by-case basis, we get called about someone who's in a situation to be a potential donor. We have routine referral. So what happens is, in this country, in these countries, and the Spanish model is famous for, is that each hospital, every single hospital, has an employed transplant coordinator in the hospital who's an MD in the critical care unit. Part of their salary is not just to be critical care and taking care of the patient, but they literally are paid to be a coordinator. So there's a lot of trust in doctors in these communities. A lot of trust. You know, think about it. Critical care physician taking care of your family member, and then they're paid to actually look for donors on top, you know, so they're sort of switching their head around. You'd think that would be a conflict of interest. In the U.S., that would be considered a conflict of interest, although the docs certainly understand that it's not necessarily to suggest it to a family once everything has been done. It's no different in Spain. They're doing everything possible to save the person's life. The difference is they're getting paid to also be a coordinator. And so it's an interesting premise. And that structure is why they're more successful. So in every hospital in Spain, and the rates actually vary in Spain. Some donation rates are 20 donors per million in certain states, and they're as high as 40 donors per million in other states. So, but the average is 34. So this is what Raphael was getting at. So this talks about kidney transplant rate of nations with presumed consent. Enforcement of presumed consent has been shown to vary, and you know, procurement is still obtained. Consent for procurement is still obtained in many nations. But what I want to show you is, so these are the countries I just listed who have, and some of this actually I don't think is accurate because I've actually re-looked at the data, and some of it's not totally accurate. But what it shows is on the first line on each graph, like Austria, it says they do 45 kidney transplants per million. Okay, forget donors now. Now you're switching to 2 kidneys per donor and whether they get transplanted or not. It says they do 45 kidney transplants per million. I actually don't think they do that because they're only at 20 donors per million. Unless people have 3 kidneys in Austria, I don't know how they do that. So I don't think the data is accurate. And then you can see the other bar is living donation. So remember, part of the thing about getting transplants is not just what Gift of Life does and has done for 36 years, and in our 37th year we're doing this living donor coordination. The key is trying to encourage anybody to donate. And so living donation is not as high in Austria. Norway has a lower utilization rate. Spain is actually, their kidney transplant rate for deceased donation is only about 36. So I'm not sure why this guy has that. But look at their living donors. Almost none. So families aren't donating, probably because they think they don't need to. The waiting lists are not that large in other countries, proportionate to the way our lists are. And that has a lot to do with national health care and whether people are getting dialysis and all those other kind of things in terms of getting on the list. So you can see the differences in living donation. You know, look at Singapore, where there's paid donation. They actually pay people to donate, which is unethical. And you know, their donation rate is the same for deceased as living. So, and then this is the other countries: us, the Netherlands, Ireland, etc. And the rate in the U.S. is actually higher. It's about 34 transplants per million. But the living donor rate is around actually around 20 or so. This might be a little bit of old data. So this is actually extrapolated the real data. I went to different websites. So Australia, this is deceased donor kidney transplants. About 20, remember, 2 kidneys. Some are not used from every donor. About 20 kidneys transplanted per million. Canada 24, Spain about 45, I apologize. US is about 36, and then we're at 55 transplants per million. You know, something from our low in the last 4 years is 48 to 55 transplants per million. So if you think about that, take 10 million, we do about close to 600 transplants a year from deceased donors, and that's how you get the number. Divide by 10 million, that's how you get it. So this is again looking at all those other countries in the U.S. You can see the U.S. is far and above. This is for living in particular. Iran, by the way, has a paid living donor program, so they actually have one of the higher rates of living donation. So here's some living donation data. Remember, Cyprus is about 300,000 people, so it really doesn't mean much in terms of 49 transplants per million, because there might be 10 people with kidney disease and all 10 got transplanted. I don't know, something like that. But you look at the Netherlands and Turkey and Iran, Iran with a paid donor program, the U.S. at about 21 or so. This is donors now. I switched back to donors, not kidneys. So that's what's going on in the rest of the world in terms of living donors. So this is a potential growth. There's only so many people who pass away who can be donors. When you look at all the population in the U.S., 2.4 million people pass away every year from all different reasons, all ages, all causes of death. About half of them die in hospitals. 2.4 million. About half die in acute care hospitals. About 1.3 million or so. When we look at records and we look at potential, only about 13,000 people in the whole country can be brain dead potential organ donors. 13,000 a year out of 2.4 million people who die. That's the problem. So everybody thinks, oh, a person dies in a car accident. No, they can't be a donor. It's not automatic. They can be tissue donor, but they can't be an organ donor. So out of 13,000, we're getting 8,000, right? With the system that we have. Could do better. We could do better. We're probably at about a 60 some percent, donation rate if you look at it from the actual denominator. When we do these record reviews, there's probably about 13 to 14,000. Maybe it's 15,000. But and when you look at the donor age, which can be as high as 85 for a liver. We've done 84-year-old liver transplant looking for a liver donor. But most of the time when we do chart reviews, we look at 75 years and under. And that's sort of the standard in the country, around 75 years of age. But people do go older in terms of donation. So again, I just pulled some of these out to show you the differences. So the GIFT Act, which is a uniform law throughout all 50 states, this was proposed actually in 1968, and it's been revised about 4 times. And what does it mean? Uniform means uniform. The idea of this National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws is they decide on certain topics and try to develop laws that are the same in every state. Because the GIFT Act is not a federal law, it's a state law. And it was adopted at different times in every state and has been revised in every state. And it has different provisions, but the basics are pretty much the same. So it's original since 1968. It was uniformly adopted. It didn't take place in 68, it was through 1972. There was a first revision in 87, and that revision was only adopted in 26 states. So why are we revising it again? Because we actually have a law pending in Pennsylvania. We passed it in New Jersey, as these folks know, the HERO Act. But we have not passed it in Pennsylvania. So practice has changed, and things need to be changed. So this is just an analysis that was done, and the centerpiece of it is first-person consent, meaning when you put it on your driver's license, and the state has it as you saying consent, not intent, like the old stickers and that kind of thing. It's consent. It means you decided you're going to be a donor. Your family can't change it. Okay? if you say no, there actually is, in most states, you can't opt out. No means you don't want it on your driver's license, not that you don't want it to be a donor. So we purposely did that. You have to make special provisions to say no to donation, which means informing your family or having a document. Why did we do that? Because a lot of people we survey say, you know what, I want to be a donor, but I don't want it on my license. So the no is not no, I don't want to be a donor. It's no, I don't want to put it on my license most of the time. Because when we survey people, 75 to 80% of the people say they want to be donors. It's just about 30% don't want to put it on their license. So that's why we have about 45 to 50% for the most part have it on their license. I'm not going to go through all this. So these are the revisions of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. You can see Pennsylvania, New York, Florida, and Illinois are still awaiting passing. So we'll probably pass it, hopefully. And we'll probably ask for your support because there are some provisions that actually might be a little controversial. It forces the coroners and medical examiners, like we did in New Jersey, to allow us to, if the family wants to donate, to allow us to remove the organs. And they have to come, if they want to do an investigation, to the operating room to determine if there's any issues with those organs that are removed, rather than just saying, we have it, we have family, coroners who say, I don't care what the family says. We're doing a murder investigation, we're doing a child abuse investigation, you can't have the organs. And we lose those organs right now in Pennsylvania. Probably about 6 or 7 cases a year statewide. Could be 18 to 20 people whose those organs get buried. Not right. We cooperate in Philadelphia every single time the medical examiner here gives us permission. He says there's no reason to rule out a case because of an investigation. So we're going to mandate it by law, and we may need support. So the principles of gift law follows, and so Gift Act. So it's a gift. So we call ourselves Gift of Life Donor Program. Well, the concept comes from wills, right? So gift laws, which are preceding the Gift Act for donation, it's about a state law. It's basically saying, I own my body, I can do what I want with my body. So the provisions under estate laws that people are making wills out for to transfer property are the exact same concepts. And that's why it's a state law, because it varies in every state. And that's why the Uniform Commission set this legal system up, so that each state could change a little bit if they wanted to. But the idea is that it's opt-in, and now we do it through the driver's license registry system. All 50 states, I'll show you data, have it. And not everyone is consent. Some are still intent, meaning you still have to go to the family. But most of them are consent, like we have in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. So what about attempts at presumed consent in the U.S.? What are the outcomes? So the first attempt actually was in '94, and I'll tell you more about what our legislation translated to elsewhere. So the background on this, and most of you probably heard me talk about this, was initiated by a family who lost a loved one waiting for a liver transplant in Pittsburgh. And they wanted to do something, so they drafted a law called presumed consent. And it was introduced by Senator DeWita in February of 1993. And interestingly, in June of 1993, our governor got a liver and a heart transplant, which is a whole sideshow type of thing that went on. And then in the end, he went back to work, and this was the last piece of legislation he signed. Obviously, he was emotionally attached to this cause. And there was some controversy in the law. It had nothing to do with organ transplants. It had to do with tissue transplants. And a tissue bank who felt that this routine referral section, which I'll talk about, would cause them harm and put them out of business because the referrals would go to the UPO. So that's a whole other story. But what happened with presumed consent was that the media didn't support it. And this was something that was proposed by a legislator who was I wouldn't call him naive, but certainly wasn't well informed, as he should have been. And so the media got a hold of it and basically said, this isn't for us. We actually didn't support it at the time. If it came up again and it was a possibility, we'd support it today. But at that time, we didn't support it because we hadn't done enough to promote donation in those days. There weren't systems set up, like the driver's license registry, or like getting people to say yes to donation before we teach them about how to say no, which was how the legislation was designed. So that's Bob Casey. He lived, I think, about 12, 13 years with a heart liver transplant, something like that. Now, of course, his son is our senator in Pennsylvania. It had a lot of components, and that's the advantage of what we had. So we had this law that we didn't like, but we said is, okay, we're nice guys though. We want to basically help donation. That's what we do. So we tried to get the Hospital Association involved, the Medical Society, the public, and said, look, we better take advantage of this attention to improve organ donation because it's not working. Donations are flat. So it has hospital requirements, public awareness, trust fund, and a committee. Routine referral is probably the most important part of it. It mandated that every hospital call at or near the time of every single person's death. At or near the time of death. That way we get called before someone is declared brain dead, or if they're not on a ventilator after they pass away. But the key was getting that referral before someone was taken off the ventilator, because those are the primary people who can be organ donors who are in a brain dead situation. So consent requests are restricted also. Rather than a third-year resident who's never dealt with a family in grief to make the request, which was happening because there was mandated request in those days. It was another law that was passed prior to this. It mandated the hospital to make the request themselves. Didn't work. It was horrible. Families didn't get cared for. So what we did was we said, you got to mandate that the OPO or a trained designated requester makes the request. Well, the only trained designated requesters are OPO staff. We also had a medical record compliance issue, so that they had to allow us to do medical record reviews. We also would fine people if they didn't call us, either our OPO or the new Pittsburgh OPO. Second component was awareness, multifaceted. We had 24-hour access to this. That was part of the issue, making sure we had computer access, and it's a legal document. The other thing it did was raise money for education. To date, it's raised over $7 million in the past 15 years. $7 million towards public education. About $700,000 to $800,000 a year come from the dollar check off from your driver's license or the car title. 50% is used for public education, 25% in schools, 10% was supposed to be used for funeral benefits. It's actually not used for that. It's actually used for living donor expenses for food and lodging if someone applies for it, up to $300 a night. So that's available to living donors. It really stems to operations in the process. And many of you heard me give this talk before, but it really does talk about the process and that family approach and consent and someone being trained to do it in an appropriate way. And if, rather than a mandated request, an effective request. And that's really a key part of the process. But actually, it's beyond that. It's actually care that occurs at the hospital even before the request is made. And, how is a family treated before the request is made is probably just as important, if not more important, where they trust people. The physicians, the hospital, the people that they're dealing with before they meet an OPO coordinator. We have a system set up, mandated referral, there's a triage. The left side is people who died or heart stops that were called, they could be a potential tissue donor. And then the other case are people who are on a ventilator from a non-recoverable brain injury. It's not car accidents. Less than 15% of our donors are from car accidents. Less than 15%. 75% of the donors come from naturally occurring hemorrhages in the brain or someone having a heart attack and they're resuscitated, but they lost blood flow to the brain. Those are the 75% of them. Most people don't think that. They think it's a 16-year-old in a car accident. It happens, but it's not. That's not the typical organ donor anymore. So it comes to our call center. There's a lot of best demonstrated practices. The coordinator is key to the process. They actually go on site for these potential donor situations and actually do some of the evaluation, communicate with the physicians, and then talk with the family. So the relationships are the most important thing. And this is really what the Spanish model's about. The way they did the relationship model was actually just hire people in the hospital. They didn't need to have outsiders come in. They just hired people. And they said, you're the designated coordinator. You need to be trained how to do this. So it's a different model in terms of who's doing it, but the concepts are basically the same. It's trust, it's working with families, and making sure that they have the proper clinical experience. So our law was adopted by Medicare, CMS, which is every hospital in the country gets Medicare, and so there's a mandate, routine referral of every single death occurs in every hospital in this country. Now whether it occurs or not, whether people get around it is a whole other issue. That has to do with implementation of the OPO in each area. So this is a slide from Jan. So the new law is an update. And this has just been introduced in Pennsylvania. It's House Bill 100, Senate Bill 750. And it incorporates all kinds of different things. And we've been working with the coroners and funeral directors and hospital association. We passed a model law, frankly, for the whole country because we had families who wanted this to occur. That's really what it was about. It wasn't about gift of life. It was really about you guys and pushing this. And having a supportive acting governor, coincidentally, who was the head of the Senate before that. And so we revised it. There were actually 3 different laws passed. The main one was the HERO Act, which changed things in such a way that basically mandates hospital participation. They can't take someone off a ventilator unless they call us. They can't. It's against the law. They have to allow us to do testing, to allow them to take a tube of blood and send it to a laboratory to see if they have infectious diseases. They have to let us do that. They can't deny that. So medically, clinically, a lot has changed because of Joe Patina's family. So anyhow, so this happened 3 years ago. Took about 18 months to get people to get it passed. It started out as presumed consent. Cody was another guy who said, presumed consent, got to do it. I want to improve organ donation. And we talked to them and said, if you want to do something, let's change other things because it's just not going to pass. We had all these groups coming out, particularly for the northern part of the state, religious groups who said that no, we don't even believe in brain death, let alone organ donation. Other people feeling that it was biased against minorities because people aren't getting proper health care, let alone mandating organ donation. So there are all these things that happen politically, and you just sort of have to teach people the right way to go. It mandated education. So similar to what we did in '94, but the concept is it mandated things. It wasn't just raising money to voluntarily do it. This mandates education in high schools and colleges, and medical and nursing schools, and we're in the process of implementing that. And it should change donation. The Motor Vehicle Commission had to allow us to get it on their website, to make sure that we had access, and they had every excuse in the world why it wasn't going to happen, and we got it to happen because of the law. And then funding, there has to be voluntary contributions to a trust fund. There is voluntary contributions right now for driver's plate, license plates that you can buy in the state, and some of that money, which is not a lot, and not a lot of people have them, can go to the OPOs for grants. It's a couple $100 a year. So what will happen in the future is a person can't renew their driver's license unless they designate themselves as a donor, or they actually have to read something that teaches them about donation to give them an informed decision. Okay, and that was a big deal. This was a 5-year implementation plan. We'll probably get down to the wire to make sure that they do it. So this was actually in Delaware. The legislator in Southern Delaware, didn't talk to us, just introduced this legislation, and we went down to talk to him after he introduced it. Again, thought he was doing good. I mean, it's not a bad thing. In the end, it got withdrawn because of the opposition in the media. This is, I'm trying to figure out where this was from. Oh, this is just a paper that talks about, it should, that we should use it. So there is some academic people who think it might change things, but they're always academic people, not practical people. This is from the British Medical Journal. The available evidence suggests that presumed consent is associated with increased organ donation, even when other factors are accounted for. However, it can't be inferred from this that the introduction of presumed consent legislation will lead to an increase in donation. The availability of potential donors, the underpinning infrastructure for transplantation, wealth and investment in healthcare, and underlying public attitudes will all have a role. So it's not as simple as just passing along. There's our friend Art Kaplan from Penn. He always has a different opinion than everybody else. He doesn't even think the registries are worthwhile. Definitely do presumed consent because cards and licenses will get lost. Well, he's so misinformed, he doesn't realize that we won't use cards or licenses. We actually have a computerized registry. So someday he'll catch up. This is in 2010 from our esteemed ethicist at Penn. He doesn't even know what the system is. And there's other people. Sally Sattel is a kidney recipient who wants paid donation. She's actually a writer. She's saying, when altruism isn't enough, the case for compensating kidney donors. She believes that a lot of people would benefit if we just paid people to donate. And then Lynn Berg, who's my colleague in New York, she's talking about potentially working with the legislator on presumed consent. Colorado recently introduced presumed consent. It's still out there. It has not been through committee. It hasn't been really introduced in any way. It's just a concept from the legislator. UNOS, 1993, did not support it. Ethically, presumed consent offers inadequate safeguard for protecting the individual autonomy of prospective donors. The subcommittee recommends the policy of required response as an alternative. This is basically just say no before Act 102 in Pennsylvania. Ethically required response emphasizes the autonomy of the individual, making unnecessary any presumption of individuals' willingness to donate. So, again, it wasn't supported even from the transplant community a long time ago. Ontario tried it. This was in 08, I think. And then New York. This is from NPR. I guess that's not the same thing. But, somebody's opinion. It says presumed consent should occur. Again, a lot of academic people. But the news usually talks about this. And this is about Representative Brodsky, who had a daughter who was waiting for a kidney in New York. And he introduced it a couple of years ago. They had a state commission, actually was part of the state commission to review it. And basically the state commission said that we weren't ready. And he went away for 2 years, and then he came back and reintroduced it. But it hasn't gone anywhere. So that's Mr. Brodsky. And that was just an article this week. That's all I do. So he's still on the case, and we'll see if it happens in New York. We don't think it will. I think it's a nice thing. I hope the New Yorkers will figure a way to take advantage of the attention and promote donation, which is probably the best thing they can do. But we'll see. That's his daughter, by the way. And this is an article from 2 years ago, after Steve Jobs got a transplant. The opt-out system was opposed by Muslims who rejected the organ removal on religious grounds. Mark Kaplan we talked about. Now there's actually a website. I don't know if you knew this, Jim. Did you know that?
Yep.
Presumed Consent Foundation, who actually has all the opinions of why it should happen. And this just shows you in the end what's happened with designations and how it translates to donors. So every state now, all 50 states have a registry. The goal for this National Donor Designation Collaborative was to have 100 million people registered. We started with 65 million about 3.5 years ago. We're up to 94 million people registered, so not bad. And that this, we think, is about, the goal of 100 million is about half the people who have driver's license or ID cards. So there's probably about 100 million people in the country who are too young, too old, don't drive, don't have ID cards, are not included because we don't think they go to the driver's license registry. So this was the goal. And it looks like we'll probably reach the goal in the next 18 months or so. So in conclusion, presumed consent appears to be associated with increased donation rates, but presumed consent alone does not explain the variation of donation rates between different countries. Other factors may include availability of donors, the OPO donation, hospital infrastructure, legislation, wealth and investment in healthcare, healthcare education and public education, and attitudes, including DMV registries. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. So let's talk. I did talk. I didn't think I was going to talk that long. I thought I was going to talk for 30 minutes, but that's sort of normal. It always goes to an hour.
Howard, I've heard people say that the whole argument about presumed consent that will ultimately go away, the ability of science to generate organs. But what's your opinion on something like that?
Well, you guys ought to write this website down. It's called TED, capital T-E-D. I forget what it stands for.
TED.com.
Yeah, TED.com. So what this organization does is organizes world experts in all kinds of things, and they give these guest lectures. So there's one guy I think he's at Duke, could be at University of North Carolina, but he's in North Carolina, has actually taken stem cells and trained them to do certain things. And the first thing he did was an ear. You may have seen that. Not functional. You can't just slap it onto somebody's head. It looks like an ear. The cells, when you biopsy them, are ear cells when you compare them. Doesn't mean it's necessarily functional. It's basically the skin of an ear. The other thing that they've been successful in doing is developing a bladder. right? Bladder's just a tank. So they have skin cells, and the company actually that is the venture capital company who's helping him, he's actually the chairman of the advisory committee, is in King of Prussia. It's called Kenjion. So the third thing he's done, and this is this lecture that he gave, it's a very interesting lecture that he gave about 2 years ago. And I wish I forget his name. But you just go on their website and look and search for kidney. He calls it printing the kidney or something like that. He has a machine, almost like a printer, that he developed the kidney on. And it looks like a kidney. Within a day, he develops this thing that looks like a kidney. Now again, it's not functional, can't be transplanted, that kind of thing. So the big question is, and he's got venture capital behind him to develop these techniques, is whether it's a reality or not. Most of us say, it's always in the future. It's always 5 to 10 years out, and always will be. And it's sort of like during my career, there was they took hearts from baboons, and they took kidneys, livers from monkeys, and transplanted them. And there was huge outrage from the animal rights people and all that kind of stuff. And some of them worked for a day or two, that kind of thing. So everybody thought, well, xenotransplant, which is taking it from a different species and transplant, was going to be the future. And that was in the 80s, the early 80s, the mid 80s. Well, almost no one, the pig, we thought the pig was going to be the model actually. They had these, they're called knockout pigs. They knocked out all the immune systems and made it, the genetic pool so it didn't have any diseases that would affect humans. So they thought they'd grow kidneys or livers in these pigs and transplant them. Hasn't happened. They've done some things with liver cells where they actually can do like a liver dialysis, which is a possibility at some point. And actually doing transplants from liver cells to children. There's some success in that and trying to, the liver's one of the few organs that actually regenerates healthy cells if you have healthy cells. And so that's part of the future potential of that. In my lifetime, I don't think it's going to happen. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Howard, we actually had the speaker in here talking about from the program you talked about for the bladders.
Kenjion?
Yeah, he was here.
Oh, yeah?
He was presenting to this group, and they had 10 that had done and survived children with bladders at that time.
We have that on tape.
I think so.
Yeah.
Now,
I don't know who you had here, but the CEO was just fired from that group.
it was the CFO came out for that one.
The CFO or the Chief Operating Officer?
No, CFO.
Oh, okay.
It was rather strange to have a financial guy, but he certainly knew what he was talking about, didn't he, Steve?
Yeah.
The other thing, Howard, an alternative to that, not the same certainly, is the ex vivo lung process that's just got approved by the FDA.
Yeah.
That came out of Canada and is now, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a machine that we've had a kidney preservation machine for 40 years. Kidney preservation machine basically has two goals. One is to keep the kidney cold at like 4 degrees centigrade, which is almost freezing, by pushing the fluid through the kidney, circulating it through the arterial system, your arteries, through the arterial system, through the microvascular of the kidney. The kidney's got a gazillion blood vessels. That's what it is. It's just about 7 million cells of minute blood vessels. And anyhow, it circulates through that, so it keeps it cold from the inside out. And then it returns through the venous system and dumps back in, and we recirculate the solution. So keeping it cold. And also what it does is measure, in simple terms, the plaque inside the kidney from normal disease. So all this, as we get older, you get plaque in your arteries. We also get plaque inside the kidney. Even a normal kidney, it's starts to decrease in function slightly, you wouldn't notice it. Your lab values called creatinine wouldn't change. But when you start to look at it under a microscope, you start to see microscopic changes. What the machine does is actually, kidney machine measures pressures and flows. If you have a clogged pipe, it takes more pressure to get that much solution, water through it. Same thing with your kidney, we're preserving it. It takes a high pressure and you have a low flow. Well, that's probably got a lot of plaque inside, and we'll actually see that actually when we do it, put on a microscope. The lung preservation machine is actually different. The lung preservation machine concept is to actually take a lung that's been compromised. So not only to preserve it for a longer period of time, but to actually metabolically correct what's been changed in the lung. So what happens a lot of times when we have a potential lung donor, we look at the chest x-ray, we measure the oxygen in the blood, because that's how you get oxygen, is through your lungs. Well, a lot of times in an accident or something, someone gets a contusion, or there might be fluid in the bottom of the lung that won't let it contract and it can't pull in as much oxygen, or even at the cellular level. What this machine does is you take the lungs out of the body, you put it on this machine, and you basically start to breathe for it artificially, and then you also have the major blood vessels, so you can inject this magic solution, if you will, to basically resuscitate the lung. You get these lab values of, your oxygen is measured as PO2. It measures the oxygen value in your bloodstream on your blood cells. And us walking around, we probably have a PO2 of, I don't know, 150, 200, maybe 300 if we're lucky, that kind of thing. While physicians, when they want to transplant a lung, we put a person on 100% oxygen. Right now we're breathing 20% oxygen. That's what air is. We put them on 100% oxygen, and the parameters for PO2 have to go up over 300. Otherwise, the surgeon won't take the lung. So what this machine does is take oxygen levels that potentially are in the 100 to 200 range on 100% and shoot them into the 600 range because of the manipulations over 6 hours and breathing for the lung and injecting this fluid. And this is actually normothermic. It's actually not cold because the solutions that they're injecting, what happens with the kidney, we really can't do much to manipulate because it's ice cold. Nothing happens in your body when you're ice cold. The cells don't react, all that. We're just basically chilling down the kidney and preserving the blood vessels and not making it deteriorate, because when your temperature is cold, cells won't deteriorate as fast. What this does is actually take normothermic, normal body temperature, 37 degrees Fahrenheit, which is your body temperature, 8.6, and inject these chemicals that then can react to start to resuscitate the lung as if it was in somebody's body. So it's a pretty magical thing, and Duke, Hopkins, the guys in Toronto, and a couple others are trying to get FDA approval for the machine, and that could change lung transplant.
I thought I heard just last month they finally did get that approval. Could be.
They're in a clinical trial. They haven't gotten approval.
Okay.
It's a clinical trial because we're participating.
Okay. That website that you mentioned, TED.com,
yeah.
There's also a spin-off at TEDMed.com. And on one of those two, and I forget which one, but you can find it on the TRIO homepage, the link to a video of a demonstration of what he just described.
Yeah, that's on there. That's part of his lecture. Yeah, that's cool. Of the lungs or the...
Lungs.
Oh, the lungs. I thought you meant the...
He actually has people come up in the audience and touch the lung as it's breathing type situation in that perfusion chamber.
Yeah, a little bump.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, there's an act that gives a tax credit to corporations who have an employee who is out of work become a living donor. Why isn't that, companies, why isn't it more publicized, and have other states incorporated that as they update their uniform gift act?
It's actually a separate law from the Gift Act, believe it or not.
Yeah, I realize it's not, because Pennsylvania
It's a
hasn't
different-
updated.
It's a different code. When you do these laws, they're all under different codes and stuff, which I don't quite understand. And yeah, you're right. So what it says is that if you're an employer, and I think it's up to $4,000, something like
It's
that.
not, they cover all your
Expenses.
additional expenses, and you can claim as an additional expense whatever the cost is of the part-time employee.
Yeah, the concept is that it would cover a person, it would cover a person, basically the concept for an employer is to continue to let them take a leave, but continue to pay them, to keep their medical expenses and all that. And the idea is you could declare the time they were off as an expense for a tax credit, direct tax credit for the business. That's the concept of this. And there is other programs for living donors, actually for aid to living donors. There's actually a grant from the federal government that if someone needs to travel or things like that, which is other and additional auxiliary expenses from California to Philadelphia or whatever, but the grant's only allowed if the donor is 3 times the poverty level. So what's that mean? That means that if the family brings in about $60,000 or $70,000 or less, then they can apply for the grant. If they make more than that, they can't. So it's kind of weird. That was one of the provisions. But there are other states that are more progressive. Wisconsin has a law for living donation that I think has a tax rebate for the individual or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it is, up to $10,000 or something.
Can anything be done locally that let the Pennsylvania law become more publicized?
Sure.
I don't know if people know about it.
For
Even-
employers.
For employers, or even for gift of life volunteers who go out and speak, if they're going out and speaking, and one of the things they're trying to do is encourage people to
Donate.
donate, if you say, Sally, well, your employer can have their expenses covered through this Pennsylvania Act. And otherwise, she would go, well, I can't take off from work, but now she knows that she could tell her employer. I mean,
Yeah,
the volunteers could make it part of their program.
they could. The reality is probably the most important people to know that are the people who are going on the waiting list, who are bringing in living donors to be tested. Because that's really where the process starts. Certainly you could try to get anonymous donors. I mean, they're far and few between. But the real key to living donation is having people come to get tested at the transplant center and bringing donors with them. And so we should probably get materials to the transplant hospitals too, in addition to you guys talking about it. We can get some information for that. I can get John Abrams to print something, a flyer or something like that. Yeah.
I think it would be helpful.
Yeah. Okay.
Howard, to be a non-living kidney donor, or a living kidney donor
You have to
that's
be-
not related,
Non-related.
a non-related living kidney donor, are there age criteria for that? Are there health criteria?
Well, the lady who started this chain the other day, 65 years old.
Okay.
Yeah. You got to be in good health. I would assume the transplant surgeons will start to limit someone in their, probably in their 70s or something like that.
Mhm.
Because you also have to think about who the recipient's going to be.
Right.
How long is the kidney going to last? I mean, the kidney, it's got a life of its own, not just the chronologic age of the person, but, we don't know how long a kidney can last, per se. But 60s is probably okay, as long as you're in good health. This lady found out about us? Do you guys hear this story on the news? She gets her hair done on 3rd Street.
Huh.
She's driving past our building. After she got her hair done and saw our billboard, I don't know, it was like maybe a year and a half ago, it said that she had just retired. She said, I should do that. I'm going to call those guys, because she saw the 800 number. Called Diane James, our coordinator. That's how she got started.
Wow.
So,
So what is the donors being healthy people? done on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely.
I just always thought that.
Yeah, definitely. It's not about
They're
age.
not sick, so they're coming in here and then you're evaluating them for the process.
For living?
Yeah, I mean, moving them there.
Yeah.
Moving the donors or something.
Yeah, but they have to come forward, that's the key. Yeah.
I was unaware of what you said, Susan, but could someone say that's kind of like a backdoor way of paying for kidney donations?
Well, that's the big debate. That was a big debate. But what this is making living donation budget neutral. Okay, think about it. So you want to donate a kidney. Your employer says, well, fine, you got to take vacation time. Or you may have an employer who doesn't even give vacation or sick time. What this does is the person's not making money. Remember, all the employer's doing is continuing to pay the salary and benefits of that individual for whatever period of time they're off. Just making that person whole. And in turn, the employers keep being made whole. So nobody's making that money. It's not like getting paid $5,000
Over and above.
to give a kidney. You know, like they do in
Yeah, I think
other
it also
countries.
pays for the temporary help that you may have to hire to replace the person when they're out.
You know, Susan, maybe you should write this. You know more about it.
Just something that you said, and maybe I'm wrong, but we don't promote living donation or a table display or anywhere, because we don't have any piece of literature. We don't have a piece of literature, and that's a huge,
Living donation?
yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's
I mean,
pretty
when we go-
new
when
here
we're
at
out-
Gift of Life, right,
Well,
that you're
I
coordinating
mean, when
that?
we're out either
Okay.
speaking,
That's fair.
when we're out either speaking or at a table display, we're always focusing on.
Susan, email
getting
me, so
somebody
I can
abroad.
forward it to John and get him on the
Yeah,
schedule.
getting
Because
somebody.
Diane James is our living donor coordinator, and she can work with John on a brochure.
Yeah, that would be good.
Diane James came to one of these meetings
Yeah.
about 2 years ago
Yeah.
to explain the whole
Program.
Think about it,
program
but
and
we
the
don't
change
have any- But
process.
we don't have any piece of literature that would
Right.
be useful.
We've been typically not promoting it. Why?
Because we're different numbers.
No. The dilemma is, are we soliciting donors in some way different than what we do with deceased donors? And you know, that was part of the issue that some of our ethicists had about, quote, are we soliciting donors in a way that perhaps might be borderline? So that's why we've been very conservative in working through the transplant hospitals, and rather than promoting it ourselves. But we are out of the box now.
You are out.
Yeah. We had all 5 TV stations here the other day. So, yeah.
Howard, I just want to check a couple of the numbers to make sure I understand them, because I think they're pretty powerful. You said there are 2.4 million people that die every year,
Yes.
and only 13,000 are basically eligible to become donors
Right.
because they're brain dead.
Yeah.
That's like less than 1%.
Right. So
And
think about it. Do one more division. So 2.4 million people died. About half die in hospitals.
Right.
1% of that number
Is that, okay.
are the potential donors.
Okay.
So 1% of all people who die in acute care
1.2
hospitals.
million, let's say.
Yeah, 1.3. About 1% of all the people who die in a hospital are potentially medically suitable donors. That's why there's a shortage.
And
Now
how many, what
those-
percentage of those say yes?
Well, 8,000. 8,000 became donors. There's probably more.
Oh,
There's probably more who said yes that may not have been suitable.
Correct,
Right.
but
8,000 donors last
this
year.
is the
he's trying to
total
get his
US.
number.
Total US. Yeah. Yeah.
Why is it that people who have heart transplants, down the line, they wind up needing kidney transplant?
You guys could probably answer it better than I can.
It's the medication.
Medication.
We take an awful lot of anti-rejection medication, and it affects your kidneys and your liver. That's where they're constantly, am I right, Jim?
Yep, it's all filtered through the kidney,
We take
so it's
more-
devastating to the kidneys. It's
Yeah.
all toxic to the kidneys at different points based on whichever medication. So they're constantly improving medications, they're less toxic to the kidney and also the liver.
The cyclosporin
What's the worst?
is really the worst for kids.
And that, most people don't get cyclosporin anymore unless they've already been on it for years and years and years. When Gary got transplanted, that was the only medication available. So, but a lot of times people get switched depending on how they're doing. But some people, when they switch, don't do well.
Right.
So, you know what, it's a balancing act kind of thing. And the medications now are less and less toxic, but there's still problems with, it changes the vasculature. The same thing I talked about with the kidney getting plaque in it, that's what happens with the medications. It causes more plaque in the blood vessels. And it focuses primarily in the heart blood vessels too, not just the kidney. It also can plug up, some of the, there's been people who've had bypass surgery, who've had transplants. I don't want to scare you. But if you don't have trouble and your creatinine's normal, it's probably not affecting you. So again, it depends on your body and all that stuff. Yeah.
Cynthia's heart transplant, she took from her son is having kidney problems now. Because of it affects you. And I think Jim had a program here maybe 2 years ago. Somebody from Penn was here that talked about, your engine's no good if you're tired of it. You have to take care of your whole body. You're looking at when you go to your doctor and your checkups to improve your total function, not just the organ you were getting, total function of the organs.
Yep.
What's the status of islet cells? Are they-
Disappointing.
Okay.
So islet cells are the cells that secrete insulin in your pancreas. So when you have diabetes, your pancreas islet cells are not functioning. They don't work, and they don't secrete insulin. So the original concept was replace the kidney and the pancreas, because typically people who had kidney failure had the diabetes. But when they had the diabetes that caused the kidney failure, they do both a kidney and a pancreas, right? Then the concept was, well, geez, wouldn't it be easier if we had people who we could do a kidney sooner, even from a living donor, and then later on we'll do an islet cell transplant, pancreas islet cell after the kidney transplant, because we're already on the medication. So the idea was to isolate, take a pancreas, literally homogenize it, grind it up, and then you put it through these what's called gradients, and you isolate a layer of these cells. There'll be 1 to 2 million islet cells. They abstract it literally with a syringe, and then they would inject it into the splenic artery. So you literally go under outpatient radiology, and they squirt this stuff in. So what's happened is the cells burn out. They don't regenerate. So you get this dose, right? And then they work. And then 1 year they start taking a little bit of insulin. 2 years they take a little bit more. 3 years it's not working anymore. So that's been the problem. Now it's not 100%. The other thing they're trying to do is to see if there's a way to encapsulate them in some way, so that they be time released.
Okay.
Okay, that kind of thing. So there's, but it hasn't. I mean, there's people who've had successful transplants and are insulin independent. Most of them are not insulin independent. They take less dosage. One of the criteria for particularly islet cell was people who are what's called insulin unawareness. So people who are diabetic, their blood sugar, particularly with different types of insulin, their blood sugar drops in the middle of the night, and they don't wake up. And they're a mess. Their blood sugar is 20. And so the primary focus for these islet cells was it wasn't just a regular diabetic patient who was controlled on a pump. That was not a candidate for it. It was these people who were in danger of dying because they weren't aware. It's this unawareness of their low blood sugars kind of thing that was the first focus. So we do, in Philadelphia, we do about maybe a dozen a year. Across the country, maybe there's 100 tops a year. It's just not where they thought it was going to be. The other problem with it is, long term, is unless you get islets generated from animals, where are you going to get the donors? There's only 8,000 donors. You know, there's how many diabetics? 25 million? You know, so it's not a solution.
Can one donor provide
No,
for more than one?
no, it's just the opposite. In fact, it takes sometimes 2 or 3 pancreases for one recipient from 3 different donors. So a person comes in, gets the dose, works a little bit, does another one, gets another dose. Yeah. Depends on what's called the islet yield, and they measure that from each of the cases. Yeah.
A question back to what you were speaking about earlier, about donation rates. During your program, you were talking about the donors per million of living population in Spain and in the
Yeah.
US and other countries. And I think there's another term, I think it's called donation rate, that has to do with the number of transplanted organs per
donor.
donor.
Mhm.
How does Spain's rate of that compare?
Sucks.
It sucks?
Yeah.
So that
So I showed you that, actually. If you remember what I showed you the comparison of kidney transplants per million, right? So it's almost the same as the US, maybe a little higher, and ours was almost 40% higher. So what happens is they're doing more donors, but they're not transplanting as many per donor. Okay, so I think they had 1,600 organ donors, and
So instead of going out and rah-rahing presumed consent, it should be more on presumed consent isn't so much the answer as increasing the donation rate, which is different than the donors per million population.
you're really talking about the transplant rate. Donation rate.
The transplant, I know I didn't have the term quite
Yeah,
right.
the transplant rate, yeah. So what affects the transplant rate? What do you think affects it? Not only the number, okay, so let's,
The expertise of the medical staff at the hospital, either where the death occurs or where.
let me ask you a question. Are all donors created equal? That's the issue.
So as we get fatter and sicker and.
Exactly. So what happens is that, what happens?
Donation rate.
So the goal,
It's good.
the goal is 9 organs per donor, right? Because you got 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, heart, pancreas, intestine, liver, right? And you can split the liver. There's 9.
Potentially.
Yeah. So, that's a 16-year-old donor in perfect health who didn't have, an injury anywhere. If it's possible, if it matches and all those different things. What's the reality? What did I say before? 75% are from people who die of other causes of death other than trauma, right? 15% only come from car accidents, or another 10% from trauma, like gunshot wound or hit over the head or falling down steps. So the reality is, 75% of the time, they're already working with probably somebody who's compromised in some way. They got hypertension, diabetes, other things. So what happens in those? There's 3 types of donors. A standard criteria donor, an ECD, which is an expanded criteria donor, and a DCD donor, right? Standard criteria is this classification that should be the super donor. Basically anyone under the age of 50, right? 45, ideal donor age, per se. Once you get past 50, then you have these other factors. Between 50 and 55, if you have multiple factors, you're expanded donor. If you're 60 and over, you're automatically. Well, what happens? Transplant surgeons from those donors only transplant the kidneys and the liver. And 50% of the kidneys from expanded donors over age 60 get discarded.
So will the proposed change in
Yeah,
kidney
that's what I was gonna say.
allocation
Would help that.
improve?
It would help that, because think about it. Right now, somebody offers me, a 70-year-old donor. I'd say, yeah, I think I'll pass. Why? Because I think I'll wait. I can stand dialysis because I might get a 20-year-old. But if I know that the best I'm going to do is to get a 60-year-old donor once I'm 60 years old, I'm going to take it, right? So the utilization, what happens is, once we take the organs out, or even before, we start to offer these to different surgeons. And some are aggressive and some aren't aggressive. Some have people who are older on their list, some don't. And then once we pass the 15 centers here, we go regionally, and then we go nationally. Well, by that time, the kidney's probably already out of the body, on the machine downstairs being preserved. And the longer it's out of the body, particularly from an older donor, that's not going to get used because people say, oh, if you'd have called me 5 hours ago, but we have to follow the list. We're mandated, we can't jump patients. We can't call Kentucky because we know the guy in Kentucky uses all the 65-year-old kidneys you can get. We can't do that. We have to call Pittsburgh first. Whoever's on that patient on the list, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, New Jersey. We have to go through all that. Now we have an electronic data system and we do this quick nowadays, but it takes time.
Howard, do you tell the donor family that they recovered and discarded, or do you just?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Howard, if you have a person that's incarcerated and they need a transplant, but you know they're going to be incarcerated for a long time,
Yeah.
will they get that organ?
I don't make those decisions. That all depends on what the prison says in terms, remember, they're under a healthcare system of the prison.
I take a lot of them out and several of them, they need transplants.
Yeah, but they have to get on a list. They have to go to a hospital. The prison system has to agree to put them, I'm sure they
The
dialyze.
ones that talk to me, they say they can't go on the list until they get out.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't make those decisions. That's not my job.
Howard, did you say that the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act has been enacted in all 50 states?
Yes,
But they haven't been acted uniformly.
that's correct. That's absolutely correct. The provisions are different. Now, what is uniform? Okay. The uniform part says, while you're alive and well, you can make a decision to be a donor. And now it's amended in every state that could be through a driver's license registry. What the registry means is different in each state. It means, in most states, consent, but sometimes it just means I intend to be a donor. The other thing it allows is if the person did make that decision, the family member can do it. And there's a next of kin priority. It defines that. And that's pretty standard kind of thing. What's not standard? Well, there's some other provisions like the coroner law I talked about, it mandated. We have that in New Jersey. We're trying to get it in Pennsylvania. A lot of states wouldn't pass that because of the politics of coroners saying, no, we still have to be able to make our own decisions. We're not 100% agreeing to donation. Things like the education being mandatory. That's not in all the states. In fact, New Jersey is one of the few that has it. The check off on the driver's license. So in terms of, there's other things that are attached to the narrow original field of who can donate and how you donate, to all these other things that are attached to the donation process. And that's why it's not the same.
So Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, it's consent, not intent.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's
Remember
what-
who's
Just making
going to the
sure.
legislature in those 3 states. Jan Weinstock.
You had mentioned that Brazil had tried a hard presumed consent
Yes.
law and backed out. Do any of the presumed consent countries have a hard law?
Not that I know of. I think they're all soft. So what does it mean, soft consent? What does that mean? It means they still go to the family and ask whether that person wants to be a donor or not. What is different about what we do and what they do, they typically don't get a consent form signed. They typically, because the law allows them to take the organs, what they're doing is looking for disagreement. So they're not necessarily sitting there with a consent form like we do. You know, we don't do it nowadays. We don't do consent with donor card. We basically have an authorization information form for a consent, but it's not really, because it makes the family part of the process, kind of thing.
So a hard consent as opposed to intent in the US laws is likely better than a soft presumed consent.
Yeah, if you get more people on the registry. If you get more people on the registry. Yeah, that's the key. And, you know, the problem is that we have people who are on the registry, not because they don't want to be donors, but because they're afraid to sign up. That's the major issue.
So have you had cases where you've recovered the organs?
Against family wishes?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We don't put it on the front page of the Inquirer.
I understand.
No, we do. We also have families who were so adamant that the hospital wouldn't allow us to proceed. But remember, we're inside of we're guests. Through contract, we're contracted to the hospitals. We have agreements of how it should be, but a lot of people don't want to go through the risk. You know, it's a risk management issue, whether they'll get sued or get bad PR and that kind of stuff. It still happens about once a month, where we have problems with families. And some of them may not have been good donors anyhow. A lot of times it happens with, frankly, older donors, like older donors.
How would you handle a situation if someone had signed up to be an organ donor, later changed his mind and talked to his family, and never got around to changing it, and you approached him and said, well, so-and-so, John was an organ donor, and they say, no, he told us that he wanted to change, but he never got around to doing it.
That's called, no. Actually, the law addresses that. And the law basically says we have to back down. Because that's what's called prior notice. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the OPO or the state had to be notified. So if a family's smart, they really want to get around that, they would know to say, well, but he told us that. Now, then there's one person saying that, and 20 others say, no. He wanted to be a donor. You know, because it happens. There's conflict in the family. You know, there might be a divorced couple. One wants to let it happen, one doesn't because of emotions.
It's called,
Stuff to do with this.
it's called revocable oral notice.
There you go. There's a lawyer in the Yep. And it's addressed in the actual gift act.
Well, if there's no other questions, one, I'd like to say
My
thank you.
computer died, just so you know. That was
Howard, on behalf of the trio, I'd like to say thank you for your time this evening as well.
Okay.
A little gift, the nature of success.
Okay.
And, but there's a second presentation I'd like to make from the Trio Philadelphia chapter, and that is, as I said, these are all recorded, and they're in volumes by year.
Oh, okay.
And we are in our third year of 12 programs recorded, which go across the country. And what we've done is compiled a set of the two that are complete. This is example one for the Transplant Family House.
Oh, that's very nice.
And so these DVDs, which are indexed, could be available to anybody staying in the house.
That's a wonderful
So
gift.
that's our special, and I will have down volume 2 for you shortly.
Okay.
And we're working on volume 3, of which your presentation will be issue number 4. We're up to program number 29. I think you're 29.
Great.
So, thank you again.
Somebody spoke for 2 hours.
We lose a little quality when we condense it down to one DVD, but the message is still there. So
That's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. It's good to see everybody.